This is The First Century, a podcast devoted to stories from that influential period of history including Rome, Judea, Christianity, and more. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Schmisek. Get ready to go back in time and enter a world before computers, the stagecoach, the printing press, or even stirrups had been invented for horses. We're about to enter the first century. Episode 38, The First Years of Claudius's Reign. To assist in the administration of the empire, Claudius entrusted significant authority to three loyal freedmen. Pallas, formerly a slave in the household of Antonia the Younger, oversaw the imperial treasury. Pallas in particular retained a long-standing loyalty to Antonia, and by extension to the imperial family. It was he who had conveyed to Tiberius Antonia's warning concerning Sejanus and the murder of Tiberius's son, Drusus. After Antonia's death in CE 37, Pallas passed into the service of her son, the future emperor Claudius, as a freedman. Narcissus, once Claudius's personal slave, managed imperial correspondence and served effectively as his chief secretary, while Callistus was placed in charge of judicial affairs. A fourth figure, Polybius, was likewise elevated to an official imperial role, though he did not wield the same level of influence as the other three. Years earlier, in 7 CE, Claudius had been tutored by Livy in history. Livy himself wrote a multi-volume work on the history of Rome entitled From the Founding of the City. Claudius also explored his own family history and how it fit into the broader history of Rome, and in this research he had been assisted by Polybius. So he enjoyed having him close at hand, and Polybius shared the princeps' love for history. With the help of these freedmen, Claudius consolidated power quickly. As we heard in the last episode, Claudius's third wife, Messalina, had given birth to their second child, who would become known as Britannicus, and his older sister was Octavia. The Senate had voted to give Messalina the title of Augusta, but Claudius declined that honor for her. For her part, Messalina wanted to consolidate power of her own, and she was on the lookout for any potential rivals. And who did she see but Claudius's own nieces, Agrippina and Julia Livilla, both recently returned from exile. Upon the nieces' return to Rome, they heard stories about how the body of their deceased brother Caligula had been conveyed secretly to the Horti Lamiani, the gardens of the Lamian family. There it was cremated, but only partially so, and then buried beneath a light covering of turf. The caretakers of the garden said that they were often disturbed by ghosts, and they also reported that the place where Caligula, his wife, and their daughter had been killed was haunted by fearsome apparitions each night. So Agrippina and Julia Livilla had their brother's body exhumed and cremated properly, and then entombed the ashes in a fitting manner. In the show notes, I'll include a link to the Lamian Gardens, the archaeological remains of which can be seen today. Now, the 23-year-old Julia Livilla, married to Marcus Vinicius, was spending a great deal of time at court with her uncle Claudius. As we heard in episode 14, Julia Livilla had dropped the name Livilla and went by Julia. Livilla, for whom she was named, was the first woman to be proclaimed damnatio memoriae by the Roman Senate. That Livilla, sister to Germanicus and Claudius, had engaged in a plot to have her own husband killed so she could marry Sejanus. That the Senate declared her damnatio memoriae was the gravest punishment it could inflict upon the dead, as it meant that their memory was condemned. All references to such persons were to be exculpated from Roman history, texts, monuments, and more. And this is why Julia Livilla, the youngest daughter of Germanicus and Agrippina, who had been born on the island of Lesbos, also ceased referring to herself by that name, and instead became known simply as Julia. Though to be clear, we'll still refer to her here as Julia Livilla in order to help keep things straight. Messalina saw Julia Livilla as a threat, and Messalina was aware that Seneca, the famous senator, considered the most brilliant mind of his generation, had been ordered to be executed by Caligula. Caligula had ordered his execution after hearing him speak so eloquently in the Senate. The princeps thought he could be a potential problem. It was only because one of Caligula's friends convinced him that Seneca was ill and about to die that the princeps had let the matter go. But Messalina thought that had been a mistake. So in the summer of 41, Messalina accused Seneca of adultery with Julia Livilla, who was already married to Marcus Vinicius. The Senate, which had recently proclaimed Messalina Augusta, pronounced Seneca guilty and imposed the death sentence. Even Marcus Vinicius was sentenced to death on a charge of adultery. Claudius let Marcus go to his death, but in an act of clemency, he commuted the sentence for Seneca to exile and banished him to the island of Corsica. Julia Livilla was then exiled for the second time, the first being when she was exiled by her brother Gaius for the plot against him with Lepidus and her sister Agrippina. Shortly after this second exile, Claudius ordered her to die of starvation. Messalina had eliminated a potential threat. Agrippina, great-granddaughter of Augustus by way of his daughter Julia and Marcus Agrippa, was now the last surviving member of that generation of her family. She was in Ephesus with her son and husband, who was now serving as governor of Asia. Her father Germanicus had likely been poisoned on orders of Tiberius. Her mother and 2 brothers were exiled and ultimately killed on orders of Tiberius. Gaius, her remaining brother, had become princeps and started by honoring his 3 sisters, but then Drusilla died, and Agrippina and Julia Livilla were exiled on charges of treason. After Gaius was assassinated only a few months earlier, Julia Livilla was now dead, leaving Agrippina to carry the mantle of her proud and distinguished family. In the summer of 41, after Claudius had reaffirmed the rights of Jews throughout the empire, as we heard in the last episode, Andronicus and Junia, as well as Priscilla and Aquila, continued to meet their fellow Jews outside the synagogue and talk about Jesus, whom the Jewish Christians believed was the Messiah, or Christ, and thus the name Christian. Unfortunately, these extra-synagogue meetings would frequently turn argumentative. More traditional Jews would not accept that Jesus was the Messiah. After all, he'd been crucified, also known as hanged on a tree, which clearly demonstrated that he was cursed by God, as it says in Deuteronomy 21:22-23. Jewish Christians, those of the sect of the Nazarene, did not read the Torah that way. Instead, they insisted that the death of Jesus inaugurated a new age. Jesus was now in heaven and only awaited a predetermined time before he would return in glory as the Messiah. The meetings grew into arguments, and the arguments would sometimes turn violent. On several occasions, Roman authorities stepped in to quell the disturbances. When they did, they overheard arguments about Christus, which was a common name for slaves, as it meant good or useful. The Roman authorities had no idea that the Jews were arguing about the nature of the Messiah, the Christus, meaning anointed. Soon, Claudius heard these reports and grew frustrated. He had just reaffirmed the rights of Jews throughout the empire at Herod Agrippa's insistence, but now these public meetings in the city were becoming problematic. So he determined that for the safety of the citizens, all Jews would be forbidden from having public meetings in Rome. He considered expelling all Jews from the city, but given their numbers, that seemed overly burdensome. So he issued the order, and the authorities enforced it. No Jews were allowed to have public meetings in Rome. Next time, we'll hear about some problematic activities in the coastal town of Dor and about a bold coup attempt that failed.